Chapter 6 of Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 6. The Question of Style. In discussing the value of particular books, I have heard people say, people who were timid about expressing their views of literature in the presence of literary men, "It may be bad from a literary point of view, but there are very good things in it," or "I dare say that the style is very bad, but really the book is very interesting and suggestive," or "I'm not an expert, and so I never bother my head about good style. All I ask for is good matter, and when I have got it, critics may say what they like about the book," and many other similar remarks, all showing that in the minds of the speakers there existed a notion that style is something supplementary to, and distinguishable from, matter. A sort of notion that a writer who wanted to be classical had first to find and arrange his matter, and then dress it up elegantly in a costume of style, in order to please beings called literary critics. This is a misapprehension. Style cannot be distinguished from matter. When a writer conceives an idea, he conceives it in a form of words. That form of words constitutes his style, and it is absolutely governed by the idea. The idea can only exist in words, and it can only exist in one form of words. You cannot say exactly the same thing in two different ways, slightly alter the expression, and you slightly alter the idea. Surely it is obvious that the expression cannot be altered without altering the thing expressed. A writer, having conceived and expressed an idea, may, and probably will, polish it up. But what does he polish up? To say that he polishes up his style is merely to say that he is polishing up his idea, that he has discovered faults or imperfections in his idea, and he is perfecting it. An idea exists in proportion as it is expressed. It exists when it is expressed, and not before. It expresses itself. A clear idea is expressed clearly, and a vague idea vaguely. You need but take your own case and your own speech, for just as science is the development of common sense, so literature is the development of common daily speech. The difference between science and common sense is simply one of degree. Similarly with speech and literature. Well, when you know what you think, you succeed in saying what you think, in making yourself understood. When you don't know what to think, your expressive tongue halts. And note how in daily life the characteristics of your style follow your mood. How tender it is when you are tender. How violent when you are violent. You have said to yourself in moments of emotion, "If only I could write," and so on. You were wrong. You ought to have said, "If only I could think on this high plane." When you have thought clearly, you have never had any difficulty in saying what you thought, though you may occasionally have had some difficulty in keeping it to yourself. And when you cannot express yourself, depend upon it that you have nothing precise to express, and that what incommodes you is not the vain desire to express, but the vain desire to think more clearly. All this just to illustrate how style and matter are coexistent and inseparable and alike. You cannot have good matter with bad style. Examine the point more closely. A man wishes to convey a fine idea to you. He employs a form of words. That form of words is his style. Having read, you say, "Yes, this idea is fine." The writer has therefore achieved his end. But in what imaginable circumstances can you say, "Yes, this idea is fine, but the style is not fine"? The sole medium of communication between you and the author has been the form of words. The fine idea has reached you. How? In the words, by the words. Hence the fitness must be in the words. You may say superiorly, "He has expressed himself clumsily, but I can see what he means." By what light? By something in the words, in the style, that something is fine. Moreover, if the style is clumsy, are you sure that you can see what he means? You cannot be quite sure, and at any rate you cannot see distinctly. The matter is what actually reaches you, and it must necessarily be affected by the style. Still further to comprehend what style is, let me ask you to think of a writer's style exactly as you would think of the gestures and manners of an acquaintance. You know the man whose demeanour is always calm, but whose passions are strong. How do you know that his passions are strong? Because he gives them away by some small but important part of his demeanour, such as the twitching of a lip, or the whitening of the knuckles caused by the clenching of the hand. In other words, his demeanour fundamentally is not calm. You know the man who is always smoothly polite and agreeable, but who affects you unpleasantly. Why does he affect you unpleasantly? Because he is tedious and therefore disagreeable, and because his politeness is not real politeness. You know the man who is awkward, shy, clumsy, but who nevertheless impresses you with a sense of dignity and force. Why? Because mingled with that awkwardness and so forth is dignity. You know the blunt, rough fellow whom you instinctively guess to be affectionate because there is something in his tone or something in his eyes. In every instance the demeanour, while perhaps seeming to be contrary to the character, is really in accord with it. The demeanour never contradicts the character. It is one part of the character that contradicts another part of the character. For, after all, the blunt man is blunt, and the awkward man is awkward, and these characteristics are defects. The demeanour merely expresses them. The two men would be better if, while conserving their good qualities, they had the superficial attributes of smoothness and agreeableness possessed by the gentleman who is unpleasant to you. And as regards this latter, it is not his superficial attributes which are unpleasant to you, but his other qualities. In the end, the character is shown in the demeanour, and the demeanour is a consequence of the character, and resembles the character. So with style and matter. You may argue that the blunt, rough man's demeanour is unfair to his tenderness. I do not think so. For his churlishness is really very tiring and painful, even to the man's wife, though a moment's tenderness will make her, and you, forget it. The man really is churlish, and much more often than he is tender. His demeanour is merely just to his character. So, when a writer annoys you for 10 pages, and then enchants you for 10 lines, you must not explode against his style. You must not say that his style won't let his matter come out. You must remember the churlish, tender man. The more you reflect, the more clearly you will see that faults and excellences of style are faults and excellences of matter itself. One of the most striking illustrations of this neglected truth is Thomas Carlyle. How often has it been said that Carlyle's matter is marred by the harshness and the eccentricities of his style? But Carlyle's matter is harsh and eccentric, to precisely the same degree as his style is harsh and eccentric. Carlyle was harsh and eccentric. His behaviour was frequently ridiculous, if it were not abominable. His judgments were often extremely bizarre. When you read one of Carlyle's fierce diatribes, you say to yourself, "This is splendid. The man's enthusiasm for justice and truth is glorious." But you also say, "He is a little unjust, and a little untruthful. He goes too far. He lashes too hard." These things are not the style, they are the matter. And when, as in his greatest moments, he is emotional and restrained at once, you say, "This is the real Carlyle." Kindly notice how perfect the style has become. No harshness or eccentricities now, and if that particular matter is the real Carlyle, then that particular style is Carlyle's real style. But when you say real, you would more properly say best. This is the best Carlyle. If Carlyle had always been at his best, he would have counted among the supreme geniuses of the world, but he was a mixture. His style is the expression of the mixture. The faults are only in the style, because they are in the matter. You will find that in classical literature, the style always follows the mood of the matter. Thus, Charles Lamb's essay on Dream Children begins quite simply in a calm narrative manner, enlivened by certain quippishness concerning the children. The style is grave when Great-Grandmother Field is the subject, and when the author passes to a rather elaborate impression of the picturesque old mansion, it becomes, as it were, consciously beautiful. This beauty is intensified in the description of the still more beautiful garden. But the real dividing point of the essay occurs when Lamb approaches his elder brother. He unmistakably marks the point with the phrase, "Then, in a somewhat more heightened tone, I told him how," etc. Henceforward, the style increases in fervour and in solemnity until the culmination of the essay is reached. "And while I stood gazing, both children gradually grew fainter to my view, receding and still receding, till nothing at last but two mournful features were seen in the uttermost distance, which, without speech, strangely impressed upon me the effects of speech." Throughout, the style is governed by the matter. Well, you say, of course it is. It couldn't be otherwise. If it were otherwise, it would be ridiculous. A man who made love as though he were preaching a sermon, or a man who preached a sermon as though he were teasing schoolboys, or a man who described a death as though he were describing a practical joke, must necessarily be either an ass or a lunatic. Just so, you have put it in a nutshell. You have disposed of the problem of style, so far as it can be disposed of. But what do these people mean who say, "I read such and such an author for the beauty of his style alone"? Personally, I do not clearly know what they mean, and I have never been able to get them to explain, unless they mean that they read for the beauty of sound alone. When you read a book, there are only three things of which you must be conscious. 1. The significance of the word, which is inseparably bound up with thought. 2. The look of the printed words on the page. I do not suppose that anybody reads an author for the visual beauty of the words on the page. 3. The sound of the words, either actually uttered or imagined by the brain to be uttered. Now, it is indubitable that words differ in beauty of sound. To my mind, one of the most beautiful words in the English language is pavement. Enunciate it, study its sound, and see what you think. It is also indubitable that certain combinations of words have a more beautiful sound than certain other combinations. Thus, Tennyson held that the most beautiful line he ever wrote was, "The mellow ousel fluting in the elm." Perhaps as sound it was. Assuredly it makes a beautiful succession of sounds, and recalls the bird sounds which it is intended to describe. Does it live in the memory as one of the rare great Tennysonian lines? It does not. It has charm, but the charm is merely curious or pretty. A whole poem composed of lines with no better recommendation than that line has would remain merely curious or pretty. It would not permanently interest. It would be as insipid as a pretty woman who had nothing behind her prettiness. It would not live. One may remark in this connection how the merely verbal felicities of Tennyson have lost our esteem. Who will now proclaim The Idylls of the King as a masterpiece? Of the thousands of lines written by him which please the ear, only those survive of which the matter is charged with emotion. No, as regards the man who professes to read an author for his style alone, I am inclined to think that either he will soon get sick of that author, or that he is deceiving himself, and means the author's general temperament, not the author's verbal style, but a peculiar quality which runs through all the matter written by the author, just as one may like a man for something which is always coming out of him, which one cannot define, and which is the very essence of the man. In judging the style of an author, you must employ the same canons as you would use in judging men. If you do this, you will not be tempted to attach importance to trifles that are negligible. There can be no lasting friendship without respect. If an author's style is such that you cannot respect it, then you may be sure that, despite any present pleasure which you may obtain from that author, there is something wrong with his matter, and the pleasure will soon cloy. You must examine your sentiments towards an author. If, when you have read an author, you are pleased without being conscious of aught but his mellifluousness, just conceive what your feelings would be after spending a month's holiday with a merely mellifluous man. If an author's style has pleased you, but done nothing except make you giggle, then reflect upon the ultimate tediousness of the man who can do nothing but jest. On the other hand, if you are impressed by what an author has said to you, but are aware of verbal clumsinesses in his work, you need worry about his bad style exactly as much and exactly as little as you would worry about the manners of a kind-hearted, keen-brained friend who is dangerous to carpets with a teacup in his hand. The friend's antics in the drawing-room are somewhat regrettable, but you would not say of him that his manners were bad. Again, if an author's style dazzles you instantly and blinds you to everything except its brilliant self, ask your soul, before you begin to admire his matter, what would be your final opinion of a man who at the first meeting fired his personality into you like a broadside. Reflect that, as a rule, the people whom you have come to esteem communicated themselves to you gradually, that they did not begin the entertainment with the fireworks. In short, look at literature as you would look at life, and you cannot fail to perceive that, essentially, the style is the man. Decidedly, you will never assert that you care nothing for style, that your enjoyment of an author's matter is unaffected by his style. And you will never assert, either, that style alone suffices for you. If you are undecided upon a question of style, whether leaning to the favourable or to the unfavourable, the most prudent course is to forget that literary style exists, for indeed, as style is understood by most people who have not analysed their impressions under the influence of literature, there is no such thing as literary style. You cannot divide literature into two elements and say, this is matter and that is style. Further, the significance and worth of literature are to be comprehended and assessed in the same way as the significance and the worth of any other phenomenon, by the exercise of common sense. Common sense will tell you that nobody, not even a genius, can be simultaneously vulgar and distinguished, or beautiful and ugly, or precise and vague, or tender and harsh. And common sense will therefore tell you that to try and set up vital contradictions between matter and style is absurd. When there is a superficial contradiction, one of the two mutually contradicting qualities is of far less importance than the other. If you refer literature to the standards of life, common sense will at once decide which quality should count heaviest in your esteem. You will be in no danger of weighing a mere maladroitness of manner against a fine trait of character, or of letting a graceful deportment blind you to a fundamental vacuity. When in doubt, ignore style, and think of the matter as you would think of an individual. End of chapter 6. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Of Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 7. Wrestling with an Author. Having disposed, so far as is possible and necessary, of that formidable question of style, let us now return to Charles Lamb, whose essay on Dream Children was the originating cause of our inquiry into style. As we have made a beginning of Lamb, it will be well to make an end of him. In the preliminary stages of literary culture, nothing is more helpful, in the way of kindling an interest and keeping it well alight, than to specialise for a time on one author, and particularly on an author so frankly and curiously human as Lamb is. I do not mean that you should imprison yourself with Lamb's complete works for 3 months and read nothing else. I mean that you should regularly devote a proportion of your learned leisure to the study of Lamb, until you are acquainted with all that is important in his work and about his work. You may buy the complete works in prose and verse of Charles and Mary Lamb, edited by that unsurpassed expert, Mr. Thomas Hutchinson, and published by the Oxford University Press in 2 volumes for 4 shillings the pair. There is no reason why you should not become a modest specialist in Lamb. He is the very man for you, neither voluminous nor difficult nor uncomfortably lofty, always either amusing or touching, and, most important, himself passionately addicted to literature. You cannot like Lamb without liking literature in general, and you cannot read Lamb without learning about literature in general. For books were his hobby, and he was a critic of the first rank. His letters are full of literariness. You will naturally read his letters. You should not only be infinitely diverted by them, there are no better epistles, but you should receive from them much light on the works. It is a course of study that I am suggesting to you. It means slightly more resolution, more pertinacity, and more expenditure of brain tissue than are required for reading a newspaper. It means, in fact, work. Perhaps you did not bargain for work when you joined me, but I do not think that the literary taste can be satisfactorily formed unless one is prepared to put one's back into the affair. And I may prophesy to you, by way of encouragement, that in addition to the advantages of familiarity with masterpieces, of increased literary knowledge, and of a wide introduction to the true bookish atmosphere and feel of things, which you will derive from a comprehensive study of Charles Lamb, you will also be conscious of a moral advantage, the very important and very inspiring advantage of really knowing something about something. You will have achieved a definite step. You will be proudly aware that you have put yourself in a position to judge as an expert whatever you may hear or read in the future concerning Charles Lamb. This legitimate pride and sense of accomplishment will stimulate you to go on further. It will generate steam. I consider this indirect moral advantage even outweighs for the moment the direct literary advantages. Now, I shall not shut my eyes to a possible result of your diligent intercourse with Charles Lamb. It is possible that you may be disappointed with him. It is, shall I say, almost probable that you will be disappointed with him, at any rate partially. You will have expected more joy in him than you have received. I have referred in a previous chapter to the feeling of disappointment which often comes from first contacts with the classics. The neophyte is apt to find them, I may as well out with the word, dull. You may have found Lamb less diverting, less interesting than you hoped. You may have had to whip yourself up again and again to the effort of reading him. In brief, Lamb has not, for you, justified his terrific reputation. If a classic is a classic because it gives pleasure to succeeding generations of the people who are most keenly interested in literature, and if Lamb frequently strikes you as dull, then evidently there is something wrong. The difficulty must be fairly fronted, and the fronting of it brings us to the very core of the business of actually forming the taste. If your taste were classical, you would discover in Lamb a continual fascination, whereas what you in fact do discover in Lamb is a not unpleasant flatness, enlivened by a vague humour and an occasional pathos. You ought, according to theory, to be enthusiastic, but you are apathetic, or, at best, half-hearted. There is a gulf. How to cross it? To cross it needs time and needs trouble. The following considerations may aid. In the first place, we have to remember that in coming into the society of the classics in general, and of Charles Lamb in particular, we are coming into the society of a mental superior. What happens usually in such a case? We can judge by recalling what happens when we are in the society of a mental inferior. We say things of which he misses the import. We joke, and he does not smile. What makes him laugh loudly seems to us horseplay or childish. He is blind to beauties which ravish us. He is ecstatic over what strikes us as crude, and his profound truths are for us trite commonplaces. His perceptions are relatively coarse. Our perceptions are relatively subtle. We try to make him understand, to make him see, and if he is aware of his inferiority, we may have some success. But if he is not aware of his inferiority, we soon hold our tongues and leave him alone in his self-satisfaction, convinced there is nothing to be done with him. Every one of us has been through this experience with a mental inferior, for there is always a mental inferior handy, just as there is always a being more unhappy than we are. In approaching a classic, the true wisdom is to place ourselves in the position of the mental inferior, aware of mental inferiority, humbly stripping off all conceit, anxious to rise out of that inferiority. Recollect that we always regard as quite hopeless the mental inferior who does not suspect his own inferiority. Our attitude towards Lamb must be, Charles Lamb was a greater man than I am. Cleverer, sharper, subtler, finer, intellectually more powerful, and with keener eyes for beauty. I must brace myself to follow his lead. Our attitude must resemble that of one who cocks his ear and listens with all his soul for a distant sound. To catch the sound, we really must listen. That is to say, we must read carefully, with our faculties on watch. We must read slowly and perseveringly. A classic has to be wooed, and is worth the wooing. Further, we must disdain no assistance. I am not in favour of studying criticism of classics before the classics themselves. My notion is to study the work and the biography of a classical writer together, and then to read criticism afterwards. I think that in reprints of classics the customary critical introduction ought to be put at the end and not at the beginning of the book. The classic should be allowed to make his own impression, however faint, on the virginal mind of the reader. But afterwards, let explanatory criticism be read as much as you please. Explanatory criticism is very useful, nearly as useful as pondering for oneself on what one has read. Explanatory criticism may throw one single gleam that lights up the entire subject. My second consideration, in aid of crossing the gulf, touches on the quality of the pleasure to be derived from a classic. It is never a violent pleasure. It is subtle, and it will wax in intensity, but the idea of violence is foreign to it. The artistic pleasures of an uncultivated mind are generally violent. They proceed from exaggeration in treatment, from a lack of balance, from attaching too great an importance to one aspect, usually superficial, while ignoring another. They are gross, like the joys of Worcester sauce on the palate. Now, if there is one point common to all classics, it is the absence of exaggeration. The balanced sanity of a great mind makes impossible exaggeration, and therefore distortion. The beauty of a classic is not at all apt to knock you down. It will steal over you, rather. Many serious students are, I am convinced, discouraged in the early stages, because they are expecting a wrong kind of pleasure. They have abandoned Worcester sauce and they miss it. They miss the coarse tang. They must realise that indulgence in the tang means the sure and total loss of sensitiveness. Sensitiveness even to the tang itself. They cannot have crudeness and fineness together. They must choose, remembering that while crudeness kills pleasure, fineness ever intensifies it. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. of Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 8. System in Heading. You have now definitely set sail on the sea of literature. You are afloat and your anchor is up. I think I have given you adequate warning of the dangers and disappointments which await the unwary and the sanguine. The enterprise in which you are engaged is not facile, nor is it short. I think I have sufficiently predicted that you will have your hours of woe, during which you may be inclined to send to perdition all writers, together with the inventor of printing. But if you have become really friendly with Lamb, if you know Lamb, or even half of him, if you have formed an image of him in your mind, and can, as it were, hear him brilliantly stuttering while you read his essays or letters, then certainly you are in a fit condition to proceed, and you want to know in which direction you are to proceed. Yes, I have caught your terrified and protesting whisper, "I hope to heaven he isn't going to prescribe a course of English literature, because I feel I shall never be able to do it." I am not. If your object in life was to be a university extension lecturer in English language, then I should prescribe something drastic and desolating. But as your object, so far as I am concerned, is simply to obtain the highest and most tonic form of artistic pleasure of which you are capable, I shall not prescribe any regular course. Nay, I shall venture to dissuade you from any regular course. No man, and assuredly no beginner, can possibly pursue a historical course of literature without wasting a lot of weary time in acquiring mere knowledge which will yield neither pleasure nor advantage. In the course of reading, the individual must count. Caprice must count, for caprice is often the truest index of individuality. Stand defiantly on your own feet, and do not excuse yourself to yourself. You do not exist in order to honour literature by becoming an encyclopedia of literature. Literature exists for your service. Wherever you happen to be, that for you is the centre of literature. Still, for your own sake, you must confine yourself for a long time to recognised classics, for reasons already explained. And although you should not follow a course, you must have a system or principle. Your native sagacity will tell you that caprice, left quite unfettered, will end by being quite ridiculous. The system which I recommend is embodied in this counsel: let one thing lead to another. In the sea of literature, every part communicates with every other part. There are no landlocked lakes. It was with an eye to this system that I originally recommended you start with Lamb. Lamb, if you are his intimate, has already brought you into relations with a number of other prominent writers, with whom you can in turn be intimate, and who will be particularly useful to you. Among these are Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, Hazlitt, and Leigh Hunt. You cannot know Lamb without knowing these men, and some of them are of the highest importance. From the circle of Lamb's own work, you may go off at a tangent at various points according to your inclination. If, for instance, you are drawn towards poetry, you cannot, in all English literature, make a better start than with Wordsworth. And Wordsworth will send you backwards to a comprehension of the poets against whose influence Wordsworth fought. When you have understood Wordsworth's and Coleridge's lyrical ballads, and Wordsworth's defence of them, you will be in a position to judge poetry in general. If, again, your mind hankers after an earlier and more romantic literature, Lamb's Specimens of English Dramatic Poets Contemporary with Shakespeare has already, in an enchanting fashion, piloted you into a vast gulf of the sea which is Shakespeare. Again, in Hazlitt and Leigh Hunt, you will discover essayists inferior only to Lamb himself, and critics perhaps not inferior. Hazlitt is unsurpassed as a critic. His judgments are convincing, and his enthusiasm of the most catching nature. Having arrived at Hazlitt or Leigh Hunt, you can branch off once more at any one of 10,000 points into still wider circles, and thus you may continue up and down the centuries as far as you like, yea, even unto Chaucer. If you chance to read Hazlitt on Chaucer and Spenser, you will probably put your hat on instantly, and go and buy these authors, such as his communicating fire. I need not particularise further. Commencing with Lamb, and allowing one thing to lead to another, you cannot fail to be more and more impressed by the peculiar suitability to your needs of the Lamb entourage and the Lamb period. For Lamb lived in a time of universal rebirth in English literature. Wordsworth and Coleridge were recreating poetry, Scott was recreating the novel, Lamb was recreating the human document, and Hazlitt, Coleridge, Leigh Hunt and others were recreating criticism. Sparks are flying all about the place, and it will be not less than a miracle if something combustible and indestructible in you does not take fire. I have only one cautionary word to utter. You may be saying to yourself, so long as I stick to the classics, I cannot go wrong. You can go wrong. You can, while reading naught but very fine stuff, commit the grave error of reading too much of one kind of stuff. Now, there are two kinds, and only two kinds. These two kinds are not prose and poetry, nor are they divided one from the other by any differences of form or of subject. They are the inspiring kind and the informing kind. No other genuine division exists in literature. Emerson, I think, first clearly stated it. His terms were the literature of power and the literature of knowledge. In nearly all great literature, the two qualities are to be found in company, but one usually predominates over the other. An example of the exclusively inspiring kind is Coleridge's Kublai Khan. I cannot recall any first-class example of the purely informing kind. The nearest approach to it that I can name is Spenser's First Principles, which, however, is at least once highly inspiring. An example in which the inspiring quality predominates is Ivanhoe, and an example in which the informing quality predominates is Hazlitt's essays on Shakespeare's characters. You must avoid giving undue preference to the kind in which the inspiring quality predominates, or the kind in which the informing quality predominates. Too much of one is enervating, too much of the other is desiccating. If you stick exclusively to one, you may become a mere debauchee of the emotions. If you stick exclusively to the other, you may cease to live in any full sense. I do not say that you should hold the balance exactly even between the two kinds. Your taste will come into the scale. What I say is that neither kind must be neglected. Lamb is an instance of a great writer whom anybody can understand, and whom a majority of those who interest themselves in literature can, more or less, appreciate. He makes no excessive demand either on the intellect or on the faculty of sympathetic emotion. On both sides of Lamb, however, there lie literatures more difficult, more recondite. The knowledge side need not detain us here. It can be mastered by concentration and perseverance. But the power side, which comprises the supreme productions of genius, demands special consideration. You may have arrived at the point of keenly enjoying Lamb, and yet be entirely unable to see anything in such writings as Kublai Khan or Milton's Comus. And as for Hamlet, you may see nothing in it but a sanguinary tale full of quotations. Nevertheless, it is the supreme productions which are capable of yielding the supreme pleasures, and which will yield the supreme pleasures when the pass-key to them has been acquired. This pass-key is a comprehension of the nature of poetry. End of chapter 8. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. 9 of Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Literary Taste: How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. Chapter 9. Verse. There is a word, a name of fear, which rouses terror in the heart of the vast educated majority of the English-speaking race. The most valiant will fly at the mere utterance of that word. The most broad-minded will put their backs up against it. The most rash will not dare to affront it. I myself have seen it empty buildings that were full, and I know it will scatter a crowd more quickly than a hosepipe, hornets, or the rumour of plague. Even to murmur it is to incur solitude, probably disdain, and possibly starvation, as historical examples show. That word is poetry. The profound objection of the average man to poetry can scarcely be exaggerated, and when I say the average man, I do not mean the average sensual man, any man who gets on top of the omnibus. I mean the average lettered man, the average man who does care a little for books and enjoys reading, and knows the classics by name, and the popular writers by having read them. I am convinced that not one man in 10 who reads poetry, at any rate knowingly. I am convinced, further, that not one man in 10 who goes so far as to knowingly buy poetry ever reads it. You will find everywhere men who read very widely in prose, but who will say quite callously, "No, I never read poetry." If the sales of modern poetry, distinctly labelled as such, were to cease entirely tomorrow, not a publisher would fail, scarcely a publisher would be affected, and not a poet would die, for I do not believe that a single modern English poet is living today on the current proceeds of his verse. For a country which possesses the greatest poetical literature in the world, this condition of affairs is at least odd. What makes it odder is that occasionally, very occasionally, the average lettered man will have a fit of idolatry for a fine poet, buying his books in tens of thousands, and bestowing upon him immense riches, as with Tennyson. And what makes it odder still is that, after all, the average lettered man does not truly dislike poetry, he only dislikes it when it takes a certain form. He will read poetry, and enjoy it, provided he is not aware that it is poetry. Poetry can exist authentically either in prose or in verse. Give him poetry concealed in prose, and there is a chance that, taken off his guard, he will appreciate it. But show him a page of verse, and he will be ready to send for a policeman. The reason of this is that, though poetry may come to pass either in prose or in verse, it does actually happen far more frequently in verse than in prose. Nearly all the very greatest poetry is in verse. Verse is identified with the very greatest poetry, and the very greatest poetry can only be understood and savoured by people who have put themselves through a considerable mental discipline. To others it's an exasperating weariness. Hence chiefly the fearful prejudice of the average lettered man against the mere form of verse. The formation of literary taste cannot be completed until that prejudice has been conquered. My very difficult task is to suggest a method of conquering it. I address myself exclusively to the large class of people who, if they are honest, will declare that while they enjoy novels, essays, and history, they cannot stand verse. The case is extremely delicate, like all nervous cases. It is useless to employ the arts of reasoning, for the matter has got beyond logic, it is instinctive. Perfectly futile to assure you that verse will yield a higher percentage of pleasure than prose. You will reply, "We believe you, but that doesn't help us." Therefore I shall not argue. I shall venture to prescribe a curative treatment. Doctors do not argue. And I beg you to follow it exactly, keeping your nerve and your calm. Loss of self-control might lead to panic, and panic would be fatal. First, forget as completely as you can all your present notions about the nature of verse and poetry. Take a sponge and wipe the slate of your mind. In particular, do not harass yourself by thoughts of metre and verse forms. Second, read William Hazlitt's essay on poetry in general. This essay is the first in the book entitled Lectures on the English Poets. It can be bought in various forms. I think the cheapest satisfactory edition is in Routledge's New Universal Library, price 1 shilling net. I might have composed an essay of my own on the real harmless nature of poetry in general, but it could only have been an echo and a deterioration of Hazlitt's. He has put the truth about poetry in a way as interesting, clear, and reassuring as anyone is ever likely to put it. I do not expect, however, that you will instantly gather the full message and enthusiasm of the essay. It will probably seem to you not to hang together. Still, it will leave bright bits of ideas in your mind. Third, after a week's interval, read the essay again. On a second perusal, it will appear more persuasive to you. Fourth, open the Bible and read the 40th chapter of Isaiah. It is the chapter which begins, comfort ye, my people, and ends, they shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. This chapter will doubtless be more or less familiar to you. It cannot fail, whatever your particular ism, to impress you, to generate in your mind sensations which you recognize to be of a lofty and unusual order, and which you will admit to be pleasurable. You will probably agree that the result of reading this chapter, even if your particular ism is opposed to its authority, is finer than the result of reading a short story in a magazine, or even an essay by Charles Lamb. Now, the pleasurable sensations induced by the 40th chapter of Isaiah are among the sensations usually induced by high-class poetry. The writer of it was a very great poet, and what he wrote is a very great poem. Fifth, after having read it, go back to Hazlitt and see if you can find anything in Hazlitt's lecture which throws light on the psychology of your own emotions upon reading Isaiah. Sixth, the next step is into unmistakable verse. It is to read one of Wordsworth's short narrative poems, The Brothers. There are editions of Wordsworth at £1, but I should advise the Golden Treasury Wordsworth, 2 shillings and 6pence net, because it contains the famous essay by Matthew Arnold, who made the selection. I want you to read this poem aloud. You will probably have to hide yourself somewhere in order to do so, for, of course, you would not, as yet, care to be overheard spouting poetry. Be good enough to forget that The Brothers is poetry. The Brothers is a short story with a plain, clear plot. Read it as such. Read it simply for the story. It is very important at this critical stage that you should not embarrass your mind with preoccupations as to the form in which Wordsworth has told his story. Wordsworth's object was to tell a story as well as he could, just that. In reading aloud, do not pay any more attention to the metre than you feel naturally inclined to pay. After a few lines, the metre will present itself to you. Do not worry as to what kind of metre it is. When you have finished the perusal, examine your sensations. Your sensations after reading this poem, and perhaps one or two other narrative poems of Wordsworth, such as Michael, will be different from the sensations produced in you by reading an ordinary, or even a very extraordinary, short story in prose. They may not be so sharp, so clear and piquant, but they will probably be, in their mysteriousness and their vagueness, more impressive. I do not say that they will be diverting. I do not go so far as to say that they will strike you as pleasing sensations. Be it remembered that I am addressing myself to an imaginary tyro in poetry. I would qualify them as being disturbing. Well, To disturb the spirit is one of the greatest aims of art, and a disturbance of spirit is one of the finest pleasures that a highly organised man can enjoy. But this truth can only be really learnt by the repetitions of experience. As an aid to the more exhaustive examination of your feelings under Wordsworth, in order that you may better understand what he was trying to effect in you, and the means which he employed, I must direct you to Wordsworth himself. Wordsworth, in addition to being a poet, was unsurpassed as a critic of poetry. What Hazlitt does for poetry in the way of creating enthusiasm, Wordsworth does in the way of philosophic explanation. And Wordsworth's explanations of the theory and practice of poetry are written for the plain man. They pass the comprehension of nobody, and their direct, unassuming, and calm simplicity is extremely persuasive. Wordsworth's chief essays in throwing light on himself are the Advertisement, Preface and Appendix to Lyrical Ballads, the Letters to Lady Beaumont and the Friend, and the Preface to the poems dated 1815. All this matter is strangely interesting and of immense educational value. It is the first-class expert, talking at ease about his subject. The essays relating to lyrical ballads will be the most useful for you. You will discover these precious documents in a volume entitled Wordsworth's Literary Criticism, published by Henry Froude, 2s. 6d, edited by that distinguished Wordsworthian Mr. Nowell C. Smith. It is essential that the student of poetry should become possessed, honestly or dishonestly, either of this volume or of the matter which it contains. There is, by the way, a volume of Wordsworth's prose in the Scott Library, 1s. Those who have not read Wordsworth on poetry can have no idea of the naive charm and helpful radiance of his expounding. I feel that I cannot too strongly press Wordsworth's criticism upon you. Between Wordsworth and Hazlitt you will learn all that it behooves you to know of the nature of the aims and the results of poetry. It is no part of my scheme to dot the i's and cross the t's of Wordsworth and Hazlitt. I best fulfil my purpose in urgently referring you to them. I have only a single point of my own to make, a psychological detail. One of the main obstacles to the cultivation of poetry in the average, sensible man is an absurdly inflated notion of the ridiculous. At the bottom of that man's mind is the idea that poetry is silly. He also finds it exaggerated and artificial, but these two accusations against poetry can be satisfactorily answered. The charge of silliness, of being ridiculous, however, cannot be refuted by argument. There is no logical answer to a guffaw. This sense of the ridiculous is merely a bad, infantile habit, in itself grotesquely ridiculous. You may see it particularly in the theatre. Not the greatest dramatist, not the greatest composer, not the greatest actor can prevent an audience from laughing uproariously at a tragic moment if a cat walks across the stage. But why ruin the scene by laughter? Simply because the majority of any audience is artistically childish. This sense of the ridiculous can only be crushed by the exercise of moral force. It can only be cowed. If you are inclined to laugh when a poet expresses himself more powerfully than you express yourself, when a poet talks about feelings which are not usually mentioned in the daily papers, when a poet uses words and images which lie outside your vocabulary and range of thought, then you had better take yourself in hand. You have to decide whether you will be on the side of the angels or on the side of the nincompoops. There is no surer sign of imperfect development than the impulse to snigger at what is unusual, naive, or exuberant. And if you choose to do so, you can detect the cat walking across the stage in the sublimest passages of literature. But more advanced souls will grieve for you. The study of Wordsworth's criticism makes the 7th step in my course of treatment. The 8th is to return to those poems of Wordsworth which you have already perused, and read them again in the full light of the author's defence and explanation. Read as much Wordsworth as you find you can assimilate, but do not attempt either of his long poems. The time, however, is now come for a long poem. I began by advising narrative poetry for the neophyte, and I shall persevere with the prescription. I mean narrative poetry in the restricted sense, for epic poetry is narrative. Paradise Lost is narrative, so is The Prelude. I suggest neither of these great works. My choice falls on Elizabeth Browning's Aurora Leigh. If you once work yourself into this poem, interesting yourself primarily, as with Wordsworth, in the events of the story, and not allowing yourself to be obsessed by the fact that what you are reading is poetry, if you do this, you are not likely to leave it unfinished. And before you reach the end, you will have encountered en route pretty nearly all the moods of poetry that exist. Tragic, humorous, ironic, elegiac, lyric, everything. You will have a comprehensive acquaintance with a poet's mind. I guarantee that you will come safely through if you treat the work as a novel, for a novel it effectively is, and a better one than any written by Charlotte Bronte or George Eliot. In reading, it would be well to mark, or take note of, the passages which give you the most pleasure, and then to compare these passages with the passages selected for praise by an authoritative critic. Aurora Leigh can be got in the Temple Classics, 1 shilling and sixpence, or in the Canterbury Poets, 1 shilling. The indispensable biographical information about Mrs. Browning can be obtained from Mr. J. H. Ingram's short Life of Her in the Eminent Women series, 1 shilling and sixpence, or from Robert Browning by William Sharp, Great Writer series, 1 shilling. This accomplished, you may begin to choose your poets. Going back to Hazlitt, you may see that he deals with, among others, Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, Milton, Dryden, Pope, Chatterton, Burns, and the Lake School. You might select one of these and read under his guidance. Said Wordsworth, I was impressed by the conviction that there were 4 English poets whom I must have continually before me as examples: Chaucer, Shakespeare, Spenser, and Milton. A word to the wise, Wordsworth makes a 5th to these 4. Concurrently with the careful, enthusiastic study of one of the undisputed classics, modern verse should be read. I beg you to accept the following statement: that if the study of classical poetry inspires you with a distaste for modern poetry, then there is something seriously wrong in the method of your development. You may, at this stage, and not before, commence an inquiry into questions of rhythm, verse structure, and rhyme. There is, I believe, no good, concise, cheap handbook to English prosody, yet such a manual is greatly needed. The only one with which I am acquainted is Tom Hood the Younger's Rules of Rhyme, a guide to English versification. Again, the introduction to Walker's Rhyming Dictionary gives a fairly clear, elementary account of the subject. Ruskin also has written an excellent essay on verse rhythms. With the manual in front of you, you can acquire in a couple of hours a knowledge of the formal principles in which the music of English verse is rooted. The business is trifling, but the business of appreciating the inmost spirit of the greatest verse is tremendous and lifelong. It is not something that can be got up. End of chapter 9. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Literary Taste, How to Form It, by Arnold Bennett, Chapter 10, Broad Counsels. I have now set down what appear to me to be the necessary considerations, recommendations, exhortations, and dehortations in aid of this delicate and arduous enterprise of forming the literary taste. I have dealt with the theory of literature, with the psychology of the author, and, quite as important, with the psychology of the reader. I have tried to explain the author to the reader, and the reader to himself. To go into further detail would be to exceed my original intention, with no hope of ever bringing the constantly enlarging scheme to a logical conclusion. My aim is not to provide a map, but a compass, two very different instruments. In the way of general advice, it remains for me only to put before you three counsels which apply more broadly than any I have yet offered to the business of reading. You have within yourself a touchstone by which finally you can, and you must, test every book that your brain is capable of comprehending. Does the book seem to you to be sincere and true? If it does, then you need not worry about your immediate feelings or the possible future consequences of the book. You will ultimately like the book, and you will be justified in liking it. Honesty, in literature as in life, is the quality that counts first and counts last. But beware of your immediate feelings. Truth is not always pleasant. The first glimpse of truth is indeed usually so disconcerting as to be positively unpleasant, and our impulse is to tell it to go away, for we will have no truck with it. If a book arouses you a genuine contempt, you may dismiss it from your mind. Take heed, however, lest you confuse contempt with anger. If a book really moves you to anger, the chances are that it is a good book. Most good books have begun by causing anger which disguised itself as contempt. Demanding honesty from your authors, you must see that you render it yourself, and to be honest with oneself is not so simple as it appears. One's sensations and one's sentiments must be examined with detachment. When you have violently flung down a book, listen whether you can hear a faint voice saying within you, "It's true, though." And if you catch the whisper, better yield to it as quickly as you can. For sooner or later the voice will win. Similarly, when you are hugging a book, keep your ear cocked for the secret warning, "Yes, but it isn't true." For bad books, by flattering you, by caressing, by appealing to the weak or the base in you, will often persuade you what fine and splendid books they are. Of course, I use the word true in a wide and essential significance. I do not necessarily mean true to literal fact. I mean true to the plane of experience in which the book moves. The truthfulness of Ivanhoe, for example, cannot be estimated by the same standards as the truthfulness of Stubbs' Constitutional History. In reading a book, a sincere questioning of oneself, "Is it true?" and a loyal abiding by the answer will help more surely than any other process of ratiocination to form the taste. I will not assert that this question and answer are all sufficient. A true book is not always great, but a great book is never untrue. My second counsel is, in your reading you must have in view some definite aim, some aim other than the wish to derive pleasure. I conceive that to give pleasure is the highest end of any work of art, because the pleasure procured from any art is tonic, and it transforms the life into which it enters. But the maximum of pleasure can only be obtained by regular effort, and regular effort implies the organisation of that effort. Open-air walking is a glorious exercise. It is the walking itself which is glorious. Nonetheless, when setting out for walking exercise, the sane man generally has a subsidiary aim in view. He says to himself either that he will reach a given point, or that he will progress at a given speed for a given distance, or that he will remain on his feet for a given time. He organises his effort, partially in order that he may combine some other advantage with the advantage of walking, but principally in order to be sure that the effort shall be an adequate effort. The same with reading. Your paramount aim in poring over literature is to enjoy, but you will not fully achieve that aim unless you also have a subsidiary aim which necessitates the measurement of your energy. Your subsidiary aim may be aesthetic, moral, political, religious, scientific, erudite. You may devote yourself to a man, a topic, an epoch, a nation, a branch of literature, an idea. You have the widest latitude in the choice of an objective, but a definite objective you must have. In my earlier remarks as to method in reading, I advocated, without insisting on, regular hours for study. But I both advocate and insist on the fixing of a date for the accomplishment of an allotted task. As an instance, it is not enough to say, I will inform myself completely as to the Lake School. It is necessary to say, I will inform myself completely as to the Lake School before I am a year older. Without this precautionary steeling of the resolution, the risk of a humiliating collapse into futility is enormously magnified. My third counsel is, buy a library. It is obvious that you cannot read unless you have books. I began by urging the constant purchase of books, any books of approved quality, without reference to their immediate bearing upon your particular case. The moment has now come to inform you plainly that a bookman is, among other things, a man who possesses many books. A man who does not possess many books is not a bookman. For years literary authorities have been favouring the literary public with wondrously selected lists of the best books, the best novels, the best histories, the best poems, the best works of philosophy, or the 100 best, or the 50 best of all sorts. The fatal disadvantage of such lists is that they leave out large quantities of literature which is admittedly first class. The bookman cannot content himself with a selected library. He wants, at minimum, a library reasonably complete in all departments. With such a basis acquired, he can afterwards wander into those special byways of book buying which happen to suit his special predilections. Every Englishman who is interested in any branch of his native literature, and who respects himself, ought to own a comprehensive and inclusive library of English literature, in comely and adequate editions. You may suppose that this counsel is a counsel of perfection. It is not. Mark Patterson laid down a rule that he who desired the name of book lover must spend 5% of his income on books. The proposal does not seem extravagant, but even on a smaller percentage than 5, the average reader of these pages may become the owner, in a comparatively short space of time, of a reasonably complete English library, by which I mean a library containing the complete works of the supreme geniuses, representative, important works of all of the first-class men in all departments, and the specimen works of all the men of the second rank, whose reputation is really a living reputation day to day. The scheme for a library, which I now present, begins before Chaucer and ends with George Gissing, and I am fairly sure that the majority of people will be startled at the total inexpensiveness of it. So far as I am aware, no such scheme has ever been printed before. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.